Welcome to Microsoft Build 2017. I'm Jeff Petty. I'm a program lead in the Windows Accessibility team, and I'm excited to be talking to you about what's new in accessibility and how to get started as a developer. If you're new to accessibility, or if you're just looking for more information about how to get started, this is a great video. I'm going to start with a little bit of a look back over the Redstone releases, including the anniversary update and the creators update. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming and then take a deeper dive into how to get started as a developer. I'd be remiss if I didn't start with our corporate mission. Our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And we take that literally. We literally mean every person. In order to accomplish our mission, we're building Windows for each of us. And that includes people with both permanent and temporary disabilities. So when you think about people with vision disabilities, you might think about people with low vision, color blindness, or people who are blind. It also includes people with temporary disabilities like an eye infection. Similarly, with hearing, you might think about people who have partial hearing loss or people with deafness. It also includes people with ear infections or a bartender that's in a noisy environment for most of their day. We also make it easier for people with limited reach or strength, people with physical disabilities, to interact with their device, as well as for people with cognitive disabilities, people with learning differences like dyslexia, or cognitive disabilities like ADHD, to focus and do more using Windows. I'll talk about how we can design for each of our users and how we can implement solutions for them in a little bit more time. But first, it's great to just talk about the Windows 10 platform and the promise that it provides. One platform with one experience and one store where you can build an accessible experience once and deploy it on multiple devices. So today, you can build an accessible app for a PC or a 2-in-1, and you can deploy that app accessibly on a phone or Xbox. And over time, the promise is that we'll be able to deploy accessible UWAs across the complete spectrum of Windows 10 devices. Now, our first-party assistive technology journey parallels the Windows journey. I said over time because we're making investments and we're delivering on that promise, but it is over time. With Windows, Windows started as a ubiquitous utility that was everywhere. It was something that was needed to get work done or to learn at school. And over time, we've been investing to ensure that it's not just needed, but it's preferred, it's wanted, and ultimately that it's loved. And our assistive technology is on that same journey. With things like our screen reader, for example, we invested in our first-party screen reader such that you could install a third-party screen reader for a delightful experience. Now with Windows 10, we're investing deeply to have great first-party assistive technology experiences that delight our users. So looking back over some of the investments in the anniversary update, I can say that we certainly focused on screen reading. Now, screen reading is an assistive technology that helps people who need assisted reading. It might be someone with dyslexia that benefits from having content read aloud. It also includes people who are blind that use a screen reader to interact with their device without using a display. And for the anniversary update, we made some pretty deep investments here. We made our screen reader faster, more reliable and accurate. We made it easier to use. We introduced a new interaction model. And we invested significantly in delightful voices. The voices in Narrator are now capable of operating at upwards of 800 words a minute. Now, that's more than is what's audible by most human beings. But we wanted to make sure that Windows wasn't setting limits on users, that the users could choose their top-end speed. And we worked in the Windows shell and app experiences to ensure that everyone could have a delightful experience on Windows 10, whether they're using a screen reader or whether they're a consumer that's not using AT. And the initial feedback has been positive. After the anniversary update, folks said we were serious, which is great, but they noted that Narrator didn't work with Braille, for example. They said things like they'd be happy when we finally have unassisted installation, or when we have things like a screen reader in setup. And this is my favorite, that our screen reader might not be a beautiful swan, but at least it's on the same duck pond as other screen readers. And frankly, that's a pretty fair assessment. Now, fortunately, we've been listening to our customers, and we knew that these were likely feedback that we were going to receive. So again, in the Creators Update, we made another round of deep investments in screen reading, and we invested in things like a Braille beta, which we just announced. And Braille is a device that allows people who are blind to interact with their PC, not only without a screen, but without sound as well. It both allows them to provide input and have content displayed through a series of cells. We also have unassisted installation for the first time. A person who's blind can actually set up Windows without sighted assistance. We're continuing to make our screen reader easier to use, and we're working with third parties so that we have a delightful first and third party experience. And we're starting to get some feedback. We're hearing things like our Braille beta is even better than some of the competitors' Braille implementations. We're hearing that we've made progress on things like our screen reader and Edge integration. And we're hearing that upgrading for people with disabilities is a no-brainer. And that's great early feedback to hear about the Creators Update. Now, lest you think that we're only investing in screen reading, it's worth calling out some of the other investments that we're making. Also in the Creators Update, we've invested in learning tools for Edge ebooks. And what that looks like is a series of tools, including things like Read Aloud, which simultaneously highlight and voice text that makes reading text pleasurable for a broad spectrum of users. That includes people with dyslexia, it includes English language learners, it includes a host of folks. We also implemented mono audio for the first time. Often when you're listening to stereo audio, the audio will be routed to a left channel and a right channel. This is an option to combine both channels into a single channel, so if you have partial hearing loss or you're only listening with one speaker, you don't miss a thing. And finally, Xbox has made some very deep investments. Copilot is a great example. This is a feature that allows two gamers to control a single character using two controllers. In essence, one is the pilot and one is the co-pilot. This enables people with disabilities to enjoy gaming. It's also great for families, parents playing with kids or friends playing with one another. And we've implemented features like real-time transcription for in-game chat. So if someone has a hearing impairment, they can actually follow along with what's being said by following a real-time transcription right there in Xbox. Pretty amazing stuff, leveraging state-of-the-art machine learning. Now, I have a video that I'm not going to play, and I highly recommend it. The reason I'm sharing it is not just the content. What it actually does is highlights many teams' contributions to accessibility over the anniversary update and the Creators Update. The reason I'm calling it out was because Terry Myerson chose to lead the Surface Studio announcement with this video. He chose to show the deep investments we're making in accessibility when announcing new hardware to the world. And I think that's a testament both to our executive support and to how deep accessibility is becoming ingrained in our engineering processes. Now, a quick look forward before I tell you how to get started. Just one slide to call out some of the things that will be coming in v.next of Windows later this year. We're going to continue to invest deeply in Narrator, and that includes investments in usability and investments in more in-box and online learning to help people discover and learn how to use Narrator. We're also investing in everyday, all-day use of Magnifier. We're doing things like making sure that Magnifier is integrated with Narrator. So Magnifier will follow Narrator focus, which is important for folks that need to zoom in and hear content read aloud. We're also going to implement font smoothing algorithms. So folks that are operating with zoomed in text through magnifier because they have low vision will get less eye fatigue and will enjoy the experience throughout their day because of the higher quality magnification. Finally, I'd call out that we're going to continue to invest in learning tools in Edge. So we have many reading scenarios in Edge, and we'll be bringing some of the features I mentioned, like Read Aloud, to those additional reading surfaces. A lot more coming later this year. Now, if you're asking, how do I get started for developers? I'm happy to say we've got some great resources for you. First and foremost, you might ask, how do I help other folks get on board? I've already opted into the video, so maybe my organization or you yourself have already expressed interest in accessibility. One thing that we found is there's no single case for accessibility. Whenever you get started, it's helpful to understand why you're doing it. And it may be about reach, about getting both those users with permanent and situational disabilities. It might be about usability, because it turns out when you actually pressure test an experience with a user with disabilities, you end up finding cliffs in your experience that you might not otherwise have found. When you ask the question, is everything accessible via keyboard? Are there any gaps in the speech experience? You end up really putting your user experience through the ringer and ultimately creating a more usable experience. It could be that you're simply selling into government and it's necessary. It could be that you're motivated to work in accessibility because empowering people is one of the ways that you find meaning in work. In our experience, all of these are reasons that teams and companies invest in accessibility. Now, to dive in and actually get started, we recommend that you start at msdn.microsoft.com/accessibility. This developer hub, which I'll bring up quickly, is a great resource, and this actually outlines all of the steps that I'm going to share with you. So on this site, you're going to find things like overview videos of the general accessibility program, how to build an accessibility app, and then how to go even further and build an app if you're doing things like using custom controls. And you'll find a wealth of resources on different frameworks, including UWP apps or UWAs, and you'll find things like sample code and forums with which you can ask questions, and even recent blogs on emerging topics in UWA accessibility. So there's a lot there, and I recommend that you definitely take a look at msdn.microsoft.com/accessibility. I'll highlight just a few things in each phase of the development lifecycle just to help you start to get started. For example, when designing, it's important to start with some principles. We certainly recommend that you make it personal. Don't treat accessibility as something completely abstract. Think about the specific personas that you want to ensure that you design and build for. For example, if you have an explicit goal to make sure that people who are visually impaired can interact with your application, then by all means, identify that as a goal and understand that persona. At the same time, it's important to keep it simple. If you find that you're actually putting so much effort into your application for a particular persona, like for example, if you're trying to create a self-voicing experience in your application for someone who's blind, or you're in effect trying to recreate a screen reading experience for someone who's blind, you're likely headed down the wrong path. And we do see this with well-intentioned developers. It turns out that if you go beyond what's recommended, things like exposing controls through programmatic access, to try and actually create a full screen reading experience in your app, not only are you taking on unnecessary work, you're actually going to compromise other experiences that rely on that same programmatic access. The same things that you do to expose an application's controls to screen readers are also used for speech command and control, things like see it, say it, and other interactions. So without question, start with some personas, but if it ends up being terribly complicated, take a step back and make sure that you've got the right approach. Now, in terms of design, I can't say it enough. We're going to talk about making sure that you understand the personas and the target audience, and talking to actual users to understand how they interact with applications. So many are the conversations I've had where somebody has said, I have an application experience and I want to create a different workflow for someone that has a disability. It could be that they're not sighted and they didn't think they'd benefit from the same workflow, or for some other reason. And in often cases, oftentimes, that's the wrong path to head down. You actually want to understand how people with disabilities interact with an application. And in general, they take advantage of the same functionality and experiences that everybody else does. It's simply that we're making them accessible so that they can take advantage of those same workflows. Now, I also want to strongly recommend that you use standard Windows controls whenever possible, because we've done a lot of work in the frameworks to make sure that creating accessibility is relatively straightforward for you. And again, you could take a deeper dive at msdn.microsoft.com/accessibility. Now, I'm going to actually jump into VS to outline a couple of the things that I'm talking about here. There are 4 things that we recommend when building. Number 1, you want to make sure that the controls you're using in your application are exposed programmatically. This exposes them to assistive technology that interacts with the applications. That could be a screen reader that's actually reading and invoking controls. It could be a magnifier. It could be a speech command and control program like Dragon Naturally Speaking or Windows Speech Recognition. But all of those different assistive technologies interact with your application because you've exposed things programmatically. So we'll look at some examples of that. And users rely on great keyboard navigation. So we'll take a specific look at that. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you these concepts using some tools that are very straightforward to use early in the development lifecycle. Wouldn't it be great if you could find, triage, and fix issues before you've ever checked in your code? Well, you can certainly do that with Visual Studio with 2 things that I'm going to focus on. One is called UI analysis, and another is called narrator dev mode. So let's jump over to VS, and let's look at a very, very simple screen. In this example, I've created a feedback screen, and it literally has just a few controls. It's got a text box for inputting a title. It's got a description text box, and it's got a submit button. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is turn on UI analysis so that it looks at my UI and identifies common accessibility issues. Now, the way to do that, I'm just going to launch my app. I'm going to shrink this window down a little bit. Yep. And I'm going to go over to Diagnostic Tools, and what I'm going to do is make sure that UI analysis is turned on. Now, I'm going to stop my app, and I'm actually going to relaunch it with UI analysis on, okay? So I'm going to run it again. And I'm going to take a quick look at the app. I mean, looking at it, my cursor's in title, which is great. It's defaulted there. If I tab, it goes to description and submit, and then it cycles back around. In general, that's the behavior that I would expect. This looks like everything's working as expected. But when I take a look at the events, right away I notice that I've got a couple of messages. And there are a couple of things that I notice here in these events. One is I've got a hyperlink that I can click for more information, and I'm going to do that. And right away it's going to tell me that I've got an issue. I've got some elements with no name, and it tells me the impact of that, the cause, and how to go about remediating it. Now, the upshot is that there's no name, so that when a screen reader or when a speech command and control application is interacting with my name or application, there's nothing for it to describe this text box. So what I need to do is actually provide an automation property, which is a name, to describe these controls to third-party assistive technology and first-party assistive technology. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to double-click. I'm going to double-click the event, and what it actually does is it jumps me to the event that needs the fix. And so what I'm going to do here on this first one, I'm going to go ahead and just add an automation property. Specifically, I'm going to add a name, and in this case, it's the title field. And that will actually go ahead and address this particular issue. I can do the same thing for the description because I know that's also an issue for the description. So I'm going to add, let me just make sure. Sorry, I'm just going to make sure I add an automation property, name, description. Okay, and in this case, I'm going to stop UI analysis, and I will run the application again. And it's worth noting that UI analysis happens at runtime because it's entirely possible for things like automation properties like name to be calculated. So this is something that has to be evaluated post compiling the application. And in this case, I see that both events that have cleared. So I'm in the clear here. Now, when it comes to keyboarding, there are other things that are worth noting. We saw that the keyboarding order was exactly as expected. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another control by uncommenting some code that I've created a little bit earlier. So I have a contact email, and I'm going to go ahead and launch the application again. And what you'll see in this case is that visually, the fields are in the order in which I want them, but as I tab through, in this case, the keyboarding is actually not in the desired order because I don't transition from title to description to contact mail before getting to submit. So here I've got an issue, and I've got a couple of different options that I can take to resolve the issue. The first option is I could add a tab index to each one of my controls. And that's an option, but what that does is it adds some overhead that I have to maintain, and what it doesn't do is it doesn't align the automation tree or the layout of the content in the automation tree to the visual order. If I want to have these actually be in the expected order and to have the content show up in my automation tree in the same order in which the visual tree is laid out, then the easiest thing to do, frankly, is to just align the XAML with the visual presentation of the content. So here I'm going to just bump that field up in the XAML. And I'm going to launch my app again. And this time, without having to add a tab index, I've got my desired order. Now, I'm going to do one last thing just to make sure that I'm ready to go. And that's, I'm going to launch Narrator, which is the inbox screen reader. And I'm going to use Narrator Developer Mode to actually experience this application as an end user would. So in this case, I'm going to hit Control, Win, Enter to launch Narrator. And I think we heard, did we hear Narrator?
Program, running tasks with access of Narrator's feedback app, submit button.
Okay, so we hear that the Narrator is running, and we see that focus is on submit, which is expected. I'm just going to tab through.
Description, editing, submit button, title, editing, description, editing.
Now, something sounded a little bit odd. I'm going to launch Narrator Dev Mode, which is caps lock plus shift plus F12.
Developer mode enabled.
And what this does is it actually represents the experience as a user would experience it. And the way it does that is it puts a screen curtain over the application, so I can't see the application, but it puts a bounding rect over where my current focus is, and it actually not only voices text that the user would hear, but it displays that text on the screen. So now I'm going to cycle through again.
Editing.
It just says editing.
Submit button.
Submit button, that makes sense.
Title. Editing.
Title editing.
Description. Editing.
Description editing.
Editing.
Well, clearly I've missed one. So if I look over in my UI analysis, if I look at my events,
Main page.
sure enough, I've got an event here that indicates I'm missing an automation. I'm missing an automation property dot name, and I could, and I could also detect that by using Narrator Developer Mode. Now, one of the nice things about Narrator Developer Mode is it ships in box with Windows. So if you have Windows 10, this is a tool you can take advantage of right away. Let me jump out of Narrator by hitting Control Windows Enter.
Exiting Narrator.
And I'm going to jump back to my presentation. So a couple of quick examples, again, of programmatic access and keyboard navigation. Strongly recommend that you turn on UI analysis in Visual Studio. It's an easy way to find, triage, and address common errors. And also, test your app with Narrator Dev Mode. You'll find a lot about your keyboard model by having to navigate your application without actually seeing the UI. There's certainly more you can do in building, and the good news is that there are things like checklists and other resources online. Now, lastly, we've talked about some testing approaches, which I highly recommend, things like UI analysis and Narrator Dev Mode. There are many other test tools that are available to inspect your application or even your custom controls. There are testing tools so that if you're a provider, you can take a deep dive into making sure that you're providing the right content through our public accessibility APIs. All of these are documented on msdn.microsoft.com/accessibility under testing. So there you can understand what tools are appropriate for what purpose. You can discover that they're available in the SDK and how to get them and install them on your local machine. A lot more to uncover in testing, and I encourage you, once again, and finally, to go to MSDN, go to the Accessibility Developer Hub, and check out what we have to offer. So much more there. How to deploy an accessible app in the store, how to build accessible custom controls, and much, much more. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a great Build 2017, and look forward to your feedback.